He is in the same country as one of his kids, but there's no plans to see old mate Harry, are there?
Exactly the way they are. That his son is a and they don't get along anymore. Even though the dad is actually...
The meeting was meant to settle a quiet question about one of Princess Diana's most treasured jewelry collections. Instead, a senior jeweler opened a sealed inventory, spoke Prince George's name, and shattered the room's fragile calm. Harry's face hardened. William stayed still. Before anyone could fully explain, the Duke shoved back his chair, crossed the room, and walked out without saying goodbye. Harry had entered the private Windsor Castle reception room, expecting answers, not humiliation. The discussion concerned Diana's sapphire set, a necklace, earrings, bracelet, and brooch preserved after her death. William sat across from him. King Charles remained between the brothers, and two senior jewelers prepared to confirm ownership. The senior jeweler opened the protected inventory and read from a documented account connected to Diana's private jewelry arrangements. A protected inventory is a controlled record identifying valuable royal possessions, their history, and the person authorized to receive them. His voice remained calm as he confirmed that the complete sapphire collection had been left for George to inherit when he reached the proper age. Harry stared at him before turning toward William, almost daring his brother to deny it. At that moment, he felt Archie and Lilibet had been erased from the conversation without ever entering the room. To Harry, these jewels were not merely expensive objects. They were a physical link to the grandmother his children would know only through photographs and family stories. His jaw tightened as the jeweler repeated George's name. "All of it?" he asked. The answer came immediately. Yes. William's silence hit even harder than the confirmation. He had known George was named in the record, but he had not expected Harry to hear the truth this way. William wanted to explain that palace officials had not recently created the instruction, yet every second of hesitation made the situation look more calculated. Harry grabbed the chair and shoved it aside, sending a violent scrape across the floor. Charles ordered him to stay, but the Duke kept moving. The king called his name again. Harry never looked back. That closing door changed everything. The fight was no longer simply about who would own Diana's sapphires. It became about an old promise, a buried wound, and which son had the right to carry her memory forward. To the palace, the collection represented history, succession, and royal continuity. To Harry, it represented the mother he lost before he was old enough to understand the full weight of that loss. To William, George's inheritance was not some victory over his brother. It was a heavy duty being placed on a young boy who had never asked to become the keeper of Diana's legacy. Halfway down the corridor, Harry stopped and pressed a hand against his mouth. Anger had carried him out, but grief now froze him in place. Diana's possessions were among the few physical connections linking Archie and Lilibet to the grandmother they had never met. Dividing those memories along royal lines felt like dividing Diana herself. William remained beside the table while Charles watched in silence. As the future king, William stood next in line to inherit the monarch's role and the responsibility of protecting royal history. That duty shaped the way he viewed the sapphires. He believed the set had to remain complete because splitting it among different households could destroy its historic meaning and weaken its place within Diana's story. "I knew he would take it this way," William admitted privately to his father. His voice carried regret, but he did not back down. George had not been selected because Archie or Lilibet mattered less, he insisted. The collection had been protected as one complete unit, and William would not apologize for refusing to break it apart simply to make a painful decision appear equal. Charles studied his elder son before answering. He understood William was defending more than jewelry. He was also trying to protect George from receiving a scattered memory and then being blamed for whatever remained. Yet Charles understood Harry's pain too, because deep rejection often sounds like raw anger before anyone notices the grief hiding underneath. George knew nothing about the arrangement. William had deliberately kept it from him because he did not want Diana's memory to feel like another royal task dropped onto the young prince's shoulders. George had never requested the sapphires, and William feared the collection might one day feel more like a burden than a gift. Harry believed Diana wanted her possessions to keep her son's families connected. William argued that the sapphire collection carried a separate instruction neither brother could casually change. That was the heart of their clash. Harry saw love that should be shared, while William saw history that had to be protected. Charles lowered his voice and warned William that Harry's outburst had started long before the jewelers entered Windsor. A forgotten conversation had transformed the sapphires from a family keepsake into a symbol of succession. Before the brothers could honestly face one another, that buried moment had to come back into the light. Years before the Windsor confrontation, a private incident had changed the fate of Diana's sapphire set. It began with a tense family discussion about whether the collection could eventually be divided, sold, or permanently taken outside the direct royal line. By the end of that conversation, George's future had become tied to jewels he had not inherited and a conflict he could never have imagined. Diana had worn the sapphires during deeply personal and public moments, giving each piece meaning far beyond its financial value. After her death, the set was placed in secure storage while questions grew over which jewels were private possessions and which had become historic royal assets. A royal asset is preserved because of its connection to the monarchy, not only because of the person who once owned it. That distinction would decide everything. Charles raised the issue during a private 2014 meeting at Kensington Palace, shortly after George's first birthday. A documented account recorded Charles warning William that the pieces could eventually be scattered among several households unless a clear instruction was created. Charles feared that once separated, the necklace, earrings, bracelet, and brooch might never be reunited. William listened quietly, but the warning touched something deeper than royal duty. He placed a small velvet case on the table and said the collection should remain complete for Diana's first grandson in the direct line. The direct line is the branch through which the crown passes from the monarch to the heir. William's words were careful, but their meaning was final. Charles rested one hand on the case, paused, and closed it. He agreed that the instruction should be officially preserved. Harry knew nothing about the meeting. When he later discovered it through a private family account, the wound became immediate and personal. He did not hear a careful plan to protect the collection. He heard proof that William had already begun dividing their mother's memory between the heir and the spare. Being excluded felt like a judgment made before Archie and Lilibet had even entered the story. From Harry's view, the palace had quietly drawn a line through Diana's family, placing one branch at the center while leaving the other outside the room. The jewelers were ordered to authenticate and catalog the complete set under a single protected succession entry. Authentication confirms that every piece is genuine, while a succession entry records who will eventually receive responsibility for it. That move meant no jewel could be gifted, removed, or separated without formal authority, and the decision was now locked in. Diana's earlier personal notes had mentioned preserving important collections for future grandchildren, but they never named George. The final arrangement was formalized after her death by those managing the estate, with William's 2014 request becoming the decisive trigger. Harry now knew exactly when the family line had been drawn. He returned to the Windsor room carrying no uncertainty, only betrayal. He had no aid, offered no apology, and had no intention of sitting down. William waited beside the table where the sapphire inventory remained open. Charles tried to speak, but Harry raised one hand to stop him. This confrontation belonged to the brothers. Years of grief, rivalry, and resentment had narrowed into one brutal question Harry could no longer hold back. When did you decide your son mattered more than mine? A private secretary had warned Harry that leaving would not change the authenticated inheritance instruction. A private secretary is a trusted senior royal aide who handles sensitive messages and official matters. Harry ignored the warning and returned anyway. He was not there to debate procedure. He wanted William to answer. William asked the jewelers and palace staff to leave. He wanted no witnesses because the fight was no longer about records or royal rules. It was about two sons trapped beneath the shadow of the same mother. When the door closed, Harry stepped forward and placed one hand on the table. "You turned her into property for the direct heir," Harry said. "The direct heir is the person expected to inherit the crown next." William kept his voice low, but his control was cracking. He insisted he had protected the collection, not his own status. Once separated, Diana's sapphire set might never be complete again. Harry spoke Archie's name, then Lilibet's. Why should they grow up knowing George received the collection most strongly connected to their grandmother? William replied that inheritance could not be rewritten every time the family suffered another wound. The words landed hard, and he knew it, but he refused to take them back. William then revealed another part of the documented family arrangement. Years earlier, he had proposed preserving Diana's personal keepsakes, private letters, and less formal jewelry for all her grandchildren. Those items carried no succession restriction and could be shared without breaking apart the protected sapphire set. Harry listened until Catherine's name entered the conversation. William explained that she had supported reserving a small sapphire charm from a separate collection for Lilibet. Catherine wanted it to create a personal connection between grandmother and granddaughter, but the idea stalled when relations between the households collapsed. Harry pulled his hand away from the table. A replacement gift, he argued, would only prove that Lilibet had been excluded from the original collection. William's expression changed, but he still refused to surrender the sapphires. Charles finally stepped between them and declared that neither brother had final authority over the collection. A binding legal instruction controlled every piece, and its terms would end the argument whether either son accepted them or not. He lifted the authenticated record and placed it between them. The sapphire set had been legally protected as one historic unit, with George named as its future custodian. Harry had returned ready to challenge William's judgment, only to discover that his brother could not give away the jewels even if he wanted to. The arrangement kept major royal possessions together within the senior line of succession. Charles explained that the set carried more than private value. If divided, the individual pieces could disappear into separate households, weakening their history and reducing Diana's connection to scattered fragments. The jewelers were not there to choose who deserved the collection. Their job was to authenticate each item, protect it, and confirm the future custodian named in the instruction. The king read the decisive clause aloud. His voice remained steady until the final line. He removed his glasses and placed them beside the record, looking exhausted rather than victorious. The document had settled responsibility for the collection, but it had done nothing to heal the grief standing on either side of the table. Harry accused his father of hiding behind the procedure. He said palace rules were being used to make exclusion look honorable. Charles answered that changing one protected instruction could create a precedent, an example others might use to challenge every historic royal collection. One act of sympathy, he warned, could trigger years of disputes. William looked away when George's name was repeated. He could already imagine the ugly public version of the story. One grandson chosen while two others were pushed aside. William demanded that no palace statement make George appear responsible for a decision created by adults. His son knew nothing about the arrangement and should not inherit blame alongside the jewels. Charles then revealed that George would not receive unrestricted ownership. He could not sell, divide, or privately dispose of the sapphire set. He would inherit the responsibility of preserving it. Archie and Lilibet would receive other private possessions connected to Diana, though none carried the same historic importance. Harry rejected that distinction. In his eyes, smaller keepsakes could not erase the message sent by the sapphires. He warned that once he left Windsor, the palace would lose control over how the decision was understood. The legal answer was final, but the emotional damage was not. By evening, the dispute reached the person William had tried hardest to protect. George noticed the tension before anyone explained it. His father missed dinner, Catherine received a rushed call, and palace aides began moving with unusual urgency. George heard enough to understand that Diana's jewelry had made Harry angry and that his own name stood at the center of the fight. Harry left Windsor without attending the planned family dinner. His security team prepared for an immediate return to London while palace officials drafted a private explanation in case the meeting leaked. A family argument could quickly become a public battle over Diana, inheritance, and the treatment of her grandchildren. At Adelaide Cottage, George waited anxiously. When Catherine entered, he asked why his uncle was angry with him. The question stopped her cold. She knelt beside his chair and immediately told him he had done nothing wrong. Catherine repeated it slowly so there could be no misunderstanding. No jewel, adult argument, or palace decision made him responsible for Harry's pain. William returned home carrying the weight of that exact fear. He had tried to protect Diana's collection, yet the arrangement had placed a painful burden on his son. Catherine told him the inheritance must never be presented as personal ownership. It had to be explained as stewardship, the duty to protect something for others instead of possessing it above them. George should one day understand that the sapphires belonged to the family's shared memory, even if he became the person responsible for guarding them. Harry spoke privately with Meghan during the journey from Windsor. He said the confirmation proved Archie and Lilibet would always be treated as less important. Meghan listened as his anger turned into determination. Harry no longer wanted a quiet explanation. He wanted to challenge the decision in a way the palace could not ignore. Then the danger grew. A senior aide discovered through a recorded call log that someone outside the meeting already knew Harry had stormed out. The leak meant the confrontation could become public within hours, dragging George into a scandal he barely understood. Later that night, William entered his son's room and sat on the edge of the bed. He promised George that no jewel would ever matter more than his family. The boy remained troubled, and William understood that palace procedure had failed. Only one option remained. William had to face Harry without officials, lawyers, or jewelers between them. He needed to speak not as the future king, but as a brother who had lost the same mother. William met Harry inside a small private sitting room before the Duke left London. For several tense moments, neither brother spoke. The anger remained, but William was no longer defending an inheritance. He was trying to prevent George, Archie, and Lilibet from inheriting the bitterness that had divided Diana's sons. William requested one final conversation under a clear condition: no palace representatives and no official account. The rules had already failed to reach the pain beneath their argument. Harry agreed only after receiving a private message revealing that George had asked whether his uncle was angry with him. Those words reached Harry more deeply than Charles's warning or the jeweler's confirmation. When William repeated the question, Harry's expression softened. He had wanted the palace to feel his anger, but he had never wanted a child to carry it. William explained that George now believed the sapphires had caused the family to turn against itself. Harry looked down and said George must never be blamed. At that moment, the argument stopped being about who had received more. It became about the emotional burden the next generation might be forced to carry. Harry admitted that the collection had never been only about money. He feared Archie and Lilibet would grow up in California hearing stories about Diana but having almost nothing physical they could touch, protect, or pass down. To him, a keepsake would prove their grandmother's love had reached them across time and distance. William responded with a confession of his own. Preserving the sapphire set had given him control over a loss he had never accepted. Breaking it apart felt like losing another piece of their mother. The future king admitted that duty and grief had become tangled together. He could no longer tell where preservation ended and fear began. William then offered Harry access to Diana's private jewelry archive, which contained personal pieces not controlled by succession rules. Harry could help select meaningful items for Archie and Lilibet when they were older. William also secured a written family commitment stating that all 4 grandchildren would learn the sapphire's history and be allowed to see the set privately. Harry reached the door and placed his hand on the knob. "George must never be blamed," he said. "He won't be," William answered. Their understanding remained fragile, but something had finally shifted. Outside the room, however, the leak was already spreading. The world was about to turn a private wound into a public judgment against the monarchy. By sunrise, Harry's departure, the jeweler's confirmation, and George's inheritance dominated broadcasts across Britain. The story had become bigger than a disagreement over jewelry. It was now a national argument about Diana's memory, royal birthright, and whether the children of 2 estranged brothers should suffer because of decisions made by adults. The palace moved quickly, but it was already behind the story. Officials confirmed only that Diana's sapphire collection had a protected future custodian and refused to discuss the private confrontation. A protected custodian preserves an important collection without treating it as unrestricted personal property. The palace wording was extremely careful because one reckless sentence could make George appear victorious while Archie and Lilibet looked rejected. Commentators split immediately. Some defended keeping the historic set complete, arguing that separating the pieces would weaken its meaning. Others insisted Diana's grandchildren deserved equal access to her legacy. The argument grew because the sapphires represented more than wealth. They stood for belonging, memory, and the painful question of who remained closest to Diana. Outside Kensington Palace, a crowd gathered near Diana's memorial gates. One woman placed 4 blue ribbons beside the flowers, one each for George, Charlotte, Archie, and Lilibet. The gesture appeared across broadcasts within minutes. It expressed what official language could not. The public wanted Diana's memory to connect the children, not divide them. A major morning newspaper pushed the scandal further. Its front page showed an empty chair beneath the headline, "Harry walks, George inherits Diana's sapphires." Catherine saw the newspaper beside a photograph of George and immediately ordered aides to remove every copy from areas the children might enter. She refused to let her son discover the family's pain through a headline turning him into a symbol. Harry then watched a broadcaster describe his walkout as jealousy. His anger returned instantly. He had spoken about Archie and Lilibet, yet the public version reduced his fears to resentment toward George. During a private call, Meghan reminded him that silence would allow other people and channels to define his motives. William authorized a carefully written palace statement. It declared that the Sapphire set would be preserved in Diana's honor and that no child should be blamed for its destination. Before releasing it, William sent the final sentence to Harry privately. Harry approved it. For the first time since the confrontation began, both households supported the same public words. The headlines would eventually fade, but the family faced one final choice. George could inherit a valuable collection as a prize, or he could inherit a duty powerful enough to outlast the anger surrounding it. The official decision remained unchanged. Diana's complete sapphire set was still destined for Prince George. Harry did not receive it, William did not surrender it, and Charles did not rewrite the protected instruction. Yet the confrontation transformed what the inheritance meant. It would no longer be presented as a reward for the senior heir. Instead, it became a responsibility to preserve Diana's memory without diminishing the grandchildren outside the direct royal line. Charles formally confirmed through the authenticated inheritance arrangement that the complete collection would pass to George at the designated age. This verified family record identified who must receive and protect the possessions. The king refused to alter it because breaking one instruction could weaken the protection surrounding other historic royal items. William then created a private family protocol for the sapphires. The rules required that the collection remain available for commemorative occasions honoring Diana and never be treated as George's personal trophy. Preservation would not mean superiority, and custody would not mean exclusion. William later brought George into a quiet family room and showed him a photograph of Diana wearing the sapphires. He explained that inheriting them meant protecting her story for Charlotte, Archie, Lilibet, and every relative carrying part of her memory. Diana's sapphires remained with George, but her memory belonged to every grandchild. In the end, he inherited a duty, not a victory. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more royal stories.